Hi, I'm Femi OK. Thanks for watching the stream. On today's episode, why does the US allow children to spend decades in prison? It is a conversation that has been inspired by our colleagues at Fault Lines, who recently made a film called 51 Years Behind Bars. Let's take a look.
In 1996, Joseph Ridings, a 21-year-old manager of an electronics store, was killed during an armed robbery in Knoxville, Tennessee. 3 young people were involved. Amanda Jo Good and Almeer Nance were both 16. Robert Manning was 20. He gave Almeer a gun and they both went into the Radio Shack armed. Amanda waited in the car. Manning later testified that he killed the manager with a shot to the head. Even though Almeer Nance didn't pull the trigger, he was convicted of felony murder and sentenced to a minimum of 51 years in prison. He's 43 years old now.
We're going to talk more about Amir and also young people, children, juveniles who are in the US prison system and why and what can be done about that. I'm not going to do that alone. I'm going to say hello to Raheem, Rafia and also Michael. Thanks for joining us. Raheem, please say hello to our audience around the world. Tell them who you are and what you do.
Hello. Thank you. I'm Raheem Buford. I'm the Executive Director of the Unheard Voices Outreach. I'm an advocate and an organizer for sentencing reform, policy changes around parole, and to give voice to the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated.
So good to have you, and glad to have you also, Rafia. Please introduce yourself to our viewers around the world.
Yes, my name is Rafia Muhammad McCormick. I am the coordinator for community outreach for Tennesseans for alternatives to the death penalty, whose mission is to honor life through abolishing the death penalty. I'm also a victims' rights advocate that is passionate about redemption and restorative justice.
Thank you for bringing your passion to the stream. And finally, Michael, good to have you on board as well. Please introduce yourself to our international viewers.
Thank you. Michael Garcia-Bohenic from Human Rights Watch, and I work on juvenile justice issues around the world.
You may have questions, audience and viewers, and if you do, YouTube is a good place to put those questions and those comments. The comment section is live. Be part of our show. Raheem, you were part of the documentary 51 Years Behind Bars. I'm just going to show our audience the page of that documentary right here on my laptop because I'm looking at Amir as, I was going to say as a young man, he's a boy. And then Amir as he is today. How are we in a situation in the United States, let's be specific here, Tennessee, where he isn't even close to finishing his sentence yet? How is that possible?
Well, that's possible because in Tennessee, we have policymakers that are very punitive. This is a Republican state, ultra-conservative, and retribution appears to be the best form of what we think is justice in this state, which is incorrect, but unfortunately, that's the state of Tennessee at this point in time.
Rafia, you come to this conversation about juveniles and incarceration from a very personal perspective. Can you tell us how you got to the place where you don't think that children should be incarcerated, regardless of what they've done, for 51 years?
So I got into this work a couple of years ago. I lost my son to gun violence. When the young man who I didn't know, he shot my son in the backyard of our home during a pool party. Before he fled the backyard, I had the opportunity to look him in the eye, and what I saw was not a monster. It was a child in fear of what they had done. And as I started to navigate my court process, I felt like retribution did not promote healing, that we needed to be able to reach these young people, especially if they're in juveniles, and be able to heal them through, whatever has caused them to get into violence, because not only does it impact them, but it impacts their whole entire family and in turn the whole community.
Michael, I see you nodding. Articulate that nod for us, please.
Well, I mean, the whole purpose of the justice system when it comes to children has to do much more with rehabilitation, with the idea that kids in particular, everyone, but children in particular, have the capacity to grow and to learn and to develop and should get a second chance. And a focus that's solely on retribution really misses out this key aspect of children's capacity for development. And that's the spirit with which the justice system should be approaching these kinds of cases.
Earlier, we asked Aldra Jackson III if he would help contribute to this program. He was formerly incarcerated, so he comes from this with knowledge of what the prison system is like. I'd love you to have a listen to Aldra Jackson III, Raheem, and then bounce off his thought. Build on it. You can debate him, but let's see what he has to say first of all. Here he is.
We do not treat our juveniles as juveniles. We don't treat our kids like kids. What is needed in the work that I see is to recognize that any child who is exposed to the juvenile justice system is a victim of trauma in some shape, form, or fashion somewhere in their lives. And the transformation that is needed is to treat that trauma and not come from a place of punishment or reform, but come from a place of healing, love, compassion, and treatment for that trauma.
Raheem, you start.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that statement. The problem here, at least in Tennessee, is that there is this label of an adult crime, as though there is this characterization for what if a child, a teenager, commits an act and it's of some nature that is violent, that it's an adult thing, which in this state, we don't take into consideration age. We don't look at the fact that this young person's brain isn't developed. We don't look at how they may have grown up in a violent situation, circumstances. We're only looking at the act itself. And if it violates some law, then we're ready to do whatever we have to do to put that person away for as long as we can.
Rafia, go ahead.
I was thinking about the fact that we just want to, in a sense, throw them away. Out of sight, out of mind. We look at our youth offenders as those other kids, that it couldn't be our child or somebody that we have love for that could do that. And so when we look at them as being others or just something that can be tossed away and sacrificed, then it becomes easy as a society to just do away with, the bad seed, so to speak. But, like Raheem said, how just because the crime that is normally committed by an adult is committed by a child does not automatically all of a sudden make this child an adult offender. And I think that is totally ridiculous when they say that we're going to try a child as an adult.
Michael, Rafia, I'm going to build on this because I'm going to show our audience something that may shock them. On my laptop, US states with no minimum age for trying children as adults. Look at these states here, Michael. You already know this. What does this mean? This means that you can have a kid, an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old. Could they be in prison?
In an adult prison, exactly. I mean, there's a real challenge with how states around the country are dealing with what they describe as serious offenses. There's a problem with what gets characterized as serious. So as we saw in the first example that we opened with, a kid who didn't really do the crime, didn't commit the murder himself, is nevertheless charged with murder on a legal technicality. And then there's a problem with just in general, the broad net that the US casts when it comes to treating children for any kinds of offenses as therefore in need of incarceration, in need of detention. And all of these things are intersecting, and it means that there are some 53,000 kids in the US every single day who are behind bars. Most of them probably should not be, could be in some other kind of program.
I am going to play for you, Raheem, a retired Tennessee sheriff, the one who was involved in Almeer Nance's case. And he has the counter argument to what you, Michael, Rafia and Raheem are saying. I would love to hear how you counter that, because I think this is the issue in the United States about incarcerating young people. Here is this former sheriff.
Tim Hutchison was the sheriff when Almeer Nance was convicted.
I can understand the 51 years.
He has no problem with him spending 51 years behind bars.
So what are you going to do? Just say, oh, well, he was 16 and had a weapon, but he doesn't need to do it just a couple of years because of his age. No, it's not that. It's the act.
Yeah, so that particular statement, again, is looking at behavior. And one of the things to understand about felony murder in the state of Tennessee is that the intention to commit murder is not present. We're talking about an intention to commit, which is a felony or robbery. And what happened in that particular situation where Almeer was not the trigger man, and yet he's sentenced as though he were the trigger man.
Do you know, Raheem, I'm thinking even beyond that, because that isn't just an argument about Almeer, it's an argument about young people who commit serious crime. Just because they're 16, do you think they should have a lesser sentence? But what we know about young people's brains, the way they operate, how they're influenced, Michael, it's fact now, isn't it? It's not a theory about young people having undeveloped brains, Michael.
Right. This is exactly right. I mean, we've come far enough in psychological research and psychosocial research to know that a colleague of mine used to say the rental car companies get it right. So they won't rent generally to anybody under 25, and they do so on the basis of actuarial data, right, that shows who's responsible for car crashes. And in the same way, the kind of impulsiveness, the sort of the kinds of motivations that under pressure, particularly in the company of others, in the company of peers, that lead young people to commit acts that they themselves will never do once they reach 25, 26, 27, that's scientifically proven. And that should be reflected in the law.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and we're in a community that we don't even teach impulse control. We have heads of state. It show continuously on media and TV that there is no impulse control. We were led in government by a person that continuously tweeted. And I find it really interesting that we use mental health and we use these types of excuses when it's convenient for us, when it's somebody that we want to excuse, when it's our youth, when it's our people of color youth.
Rafia, I'm so glad you
said that is disadvantaged.
I'm so glad you said that.
And all of a sudden, now mental health can't be inexcusable behavior. Now all of a sudden, these children are not worthy of healing and love and some kind of consideration. They can just be thrown away.
So Danko is watching right now. Danko says on YouTube, Rafia, Almeer cut funding for programs designed to treat violent children as mentally ill instead of criminals by the NYPD, possibly because the program was perceived as being racist. It's an interesting point here. Terp, who is also watching on YouTube, says those states you're showing have privately owned prisons, and there's a huge problem in the United States. It's not about rehabilitation, it's about the money. Rafia says, I'm going to articulate that with Amani, who spoke to us a little bit earlier. She's also in the documentary, 51 Years Behind Bars. This is what she has to say about the private prison system. Let's have a look.
We are trying to educate society on how this does not create safer communities for us. We are also pushing for alternatives because we know more so than anyone in our society, children have the most ability to grow and change, especially with their undeveloped mind. Our biggest obstacle to this is, unfortunately, we do live in Tennessee, which is the home for-profit prisons, meaning the longer you can incarcerate someone, the earlier in age you can incarcerate someone, the more money that can be made.
Yeah.
Raheem, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we overlook is the economic component as it relates to what we call mass incarceration and incarcerating young people. Just for the record, I was caged at a very young age, at age 18, and I received a life and 20-year sentence in the state of Tennessee. I was lucky enough not to be under a law at the time that would have given me 51 years. But had I been convicted 4 years later, I wouldn't be on this program having this discussion with you now. And over the course of that 26 years when I was caged, I understood that the more people that we can confine behind bars for longer periods of time, you have individuals who work for the prison sector here in Tennessee that otherwise may not even be marketable employed anywhere, because the state of Tennessee's prison system is responsible for thousands of employees.
I am looking, Michael, at an article here about how Germany treats juveniles. You'll see it on my laptop here. I know you know that in Europe, the way that young people are treated when they're juveniles is very different from the United States. What could be the model for the United States, Michael? What's the difference here?
Well, there are, really 3 or 4 things that are some basics. Number one is don't put so many kids behind bars. And that requires a lot of careful thinking about which are the most serious offenders, and of those, what kinds of services do they need, and how do you best provide those with the goal of rehabilitation, right? In that vein, Germany and many other European countries do in fact provide rehabilitative services. The priority is getting kids to the place where they can resume living in society, get a job, have sort of like a life plan that is staying on the right side of the law, and where they can become law-abiding, productive members of society. That's the goal. And in many cases, just that picture itself that we saw as you were scrolling down the screen shows the real difference in the physical setup, and gives you a hint of the kind of programming that's offered in a place like Germany or the Netherlands or many other European countries, in contrast to a real old school, just locking kids up behind bars. In some cases, in some places that I've been, 23 and a half hours a day behind bars, with very, very few opportunities for rehabilitation of any kind.
I'm going to just show our audience, I guess I know you know this, I'm going to show our audience here on my laptop some incarceration rates, looking at the state of Tennessee, which is very extreme. Per 100,000 of the population, this is for juveniles, remember, these are for children, okay? Look at the orange line there, way beyond the rate for the rest of the United States, and then the United Kingdom is behind, and then Portugal, Canada, and then right at the very bottom, Iceland, incarcerating the fewest amount of juveniles as far as the data is concerned here. I want to move us on because I know you have answers for what we need to do. So here is Joshua Rovner. Raheem is ready. He's ready with his answers. Here's Joshua Rovner about what is possible with juvenile incarceration. And let's focus on that for the next few minutes. Let's hear from Josh first of all.
On a typical day, about 35,000 people under the age of 18 are locked up in this country. 3,000 of them are in adult prisons and jails. Now, that's a very high number, but that's about a third as many as at the start of the century, when it was closer to 100,000, not 35,000 kids who are locked up on a typical day. So we know progress is possible. Real progress, though, doesn't come in the court system or through changes in our laws, but through supporting kids in their community, supporting their family needs, their health care, their education, their families' incomes. That's where we see real drops in offending and real drops in incarceration.
How do we keep kids out of prison, Raheem?
Well, first of all, let me just say this. We've known for decades that people age out of crime. That's number one. We keep kids out of juvenile and places like that by having a society that has compassion for people who make bad choices. But I want to highlight something in Tennessee that's very important, and even Nashville. We're talking about we're in the Bible Belt here. And we have a state that claims to be Christian. This is very important because Christians are supposed to believe in redemption. Redemption looks like a second chance in the practice of Christianity. But that's not happening here. And I think it's hypocritical for us to claim to be a Christian, even nation, and we treat our children like this. So if we would look at our kids as children and not as criminals, that would just change the dynamic in and of itself.
I am looking here at some comments from our viewers who are watching right now. This is Schultzy 100. Make no mistake about it. This is certainly about race and racism in America too. Michael, thoughts?
It definitely is. I mean, what we've heard and what we've seen is that while there are still too many children behind bars in the United States, the trend has been a downward trend since 1995. So that's great. What if we unpack that further and look at who then is behind bars, we're still seeing, especially Black kids, 4 times more likely than their peers to be behind bars. And the reasons for that we really need to examine, right? There is an inbuilt structural racism that's happening that increases the likelihood of at a police encounter of an actual arrest occurring, increases the likelihood that a kid will face charges, increases the likelihood that the prosecutor will seek more serious sentences, and that the more serious sentences will be imposed. That is, at every stage of the process, particularly for Black kids, the outcomes are going to be much, much worse on average. And I think that's something we just really need to address, confront, find a solution for.
Rafia, it's almost like you're living your principles, because as a victim's family member, that hasn't stopped you from looking for a compassionate solution and solutions. How would you share that compassion with others?
Number one, what allowed me to do this, and I think this is what us as a country needs to do, is that we need not just look at them as children, but we need to look at them as our children, all of our children, and recognize that if they do something that is bad or is malicious, or is broken, then we broke them, and take accountability for that, and to all do our part to help the healing. We need to be looking at community-based violence intervention. As you mentioned, in my case, I didn't look at this young man that had killed my son, and put the most heinous thing against me. I didn't look at him as a monster. I looked at him as a child. I looked at him as a potential possibility that he could be my child. And I thought about the fact that this was bigger than him, and this was bigger than my son. And that if we had any chance to prevent any more individuals as being shooters, such as that young man, or as being victims as my son, then we had to come up with a different way. And the interesting thing was that in my case is that, like you said, this is a retribution-based society. The billions of dollars that we spend on retribution, putting people in prison and executing them in Tennessee. There's so many things that we can be doing inside of our school systems to even prevent these kind of things from happening, to prevent juvenile getting into situations where they do not know how to use proper impulse control.
Yeah. I am just doing a little quick bit of addition here. So Almeer Nance was 16 when he stood trial. He has a 51-year sentence. He's mid-40s now. He can't get out of prison until he's 67. I want to bring in the family element, what that means to his family when you can't see your loved one for that length of time. Here's 51 years behind bars one more time.
I've never been able to take her anywhere but to a vending machine, you know. But we get along as much as we can, and any way I can be a support, a source of hope or something. So I get to tell them now that I'm in school, that I'm doing something. They know it's not just sitting in here, you know, rattling cups off the bars like you would imagine.
What have been the times that stick out in your mind where you've especially missed him?
Around prom, birthdays. For the longest, I didn't want anything for my birthday but for him to walk through the door. You know how like the little videos of the soldiers coming home? I always imagine like that'd be me, like my dad getting out of prison and surprising me somewhere.
What?
That's still a dream.